So a good place to start, I guess, proximity data centers, it may be a name that's not familiar to everyone. So just a little bit of background about sort of where it's come from and what the main objectives are.
Okay, that's fine. And in terms of the company name being familiar or not familiar, that's one of the things that we've spent a lot of time trying to address and make sure that it becomes a lot more familiar. We launched the company at the end of March last year. So we're 18 months old effectively to the market, and we've spent a huge amount of the last 18 months promoting the brand, building our proposition out into the marketplace. We secured funding from Intermediate Capital Group during 2019, and then we spent 3 months building the launch proposition, launched at the end of March, as I say. And we launched initially with 3 sites. Our proposition and our plan really is to offer 20 locations across the UK, providing high quality co-location at a regional level. The growth strategy is based on acquiring existing enterprise data centers from financial institutions, from global systems integrators, or GSIs, which is easier to say, or large corporates. They typically have built their own data centers over the last 10 to 15 years, and more recently have realized that maybe they aren't actually what they should be doing. They're a bank or they're a systems integrator, they're not a data center operator. And they've built these sites to a very high standard typically. Generally speaking, we look at tier 3 only data centers, and they've built them usually slightly larger than they need. So there's spare capacity there, and they've also realized that actually what they want to do now is that maybe over the next few years they want to move to a different architecture, and they might want to move some of what they've got there into public cloud, which could potentially lead them to having sites that are slightly less efficient. So working with us becomes a good solution to that. What we look for in a site is typically we look for well-maintained sites, which generally speaking, the sort of organizations we work with, they've maintained those sites to a very high standard, because either they're selling the service on to other organizations, or it's an internal market where they're delivering IT services to their own business, in the case of a bank, for example. We look for good maintenance, we look for spare capacity, and we look for close proximity to a large urban population. The size of sites that we target, the sweet spot, is 2 to 10 megawatts. And we look for a strong anchor customer who is willing to remain for a period of multiple years. What we offer is the ability for them to move from owner-occupier to a co-location. So it's not sale and leaseback, it's sale and colo, I guess. So effectively, we'll buy the freehold, we'll buy the infrastructure, and we will then allow them to stay on a co-location basis where we've transferred the staff, they become our employees, and we deliver the entire service back on a typically standard co-location model. And the final thing we look for is good connectivity. Now, generally speaking, there is relatively good connectivity, but one of the things we always do is we look to improve that connectivity when we buy sites. So we end up with good quality sites with immediately available white space in densely populated urban areas with good connectivity. Today, we have 7 sites around the country. We acquired our most recent 2 weeks ago when we acquired a high quality site in Swindon. That's a 7 megawatt site and is the biggest one we've acquired to date. We've got 3 more in legals, which we anticipate bringing to market in the next 2 months, ideally before Christmas. So we're looking to enter 2022 with 10 sites and giving us not the depth of coverage that we have in the plan, but pretty good UK-wide coverage. I guess that's the model really is that you can come to us, you can have a standard SLA around the country, you can have one contract, and you can take space on a ubiquitous basis. It's the same model wherever you are, and you can grow within that portfolio.
And just in terms of that sourcing process, I mean, I suspect you're very, the data center industry, I suppose, is no secret. Most people know where most of the data centers are. So do you, I won't say you literally go knocking on doors, but you approach sort of suitable sites and explain to them your model and see if they're interested, or just is word of mouth? Some people are now coming to you and saying, are you interested in this as a potential site? How does that process work?
I guess all of the above, really. And as we become better known, then organisations come to us. They find that transacting with us is shall I say, a successful experience, because there's lots of people looking to buy sites, but we only buy a certain type of site. So there are lots of data center sites out there in the UK. A lot of them are empty. A lot of them are, let's say, they're maybe not of the criteria that we look for. So we narrow it down fairly quickly. The industry agents know what we look for. They bring opportunities to us. And one of the things that attracts organizations to working with us is that we do now have a track record of transacting. We have the funding. We can demonstrate we've got that depth of funding from our partners, ICG, and we will actually deliver the deal. There's a lot of people out there who would like to do this, but might not necessarily have the funding or the ability to actually transact.
And in terms of the strategy, I mean, I don't think either of us mentioned the edge word yet, but I guess that's potentially what you would, or the description of what you're doing is. But many people have slightly different definitions of the edge. So I guess how would you see the edge? And I guess the supplementary is the way you are going about this does suggest that you think the idea of bringing, shall we say, the industry spent the last few years consolidating everything into smaller numbers of larger centralized. Mm-hmm. You think this model of bringing the data, the IT nearer to the consumer or the processing point is a major trend that you want to be a part of?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The whole thesis is about providing edge collocation. It's regional, distributed, and using the word edge is what it's about. And effectively, what we're doing is, in simplistic terms, we're taking the internet closer to the edge. I'll come back to why we're doing that in a second. But what does that mean, taking the internet closer to the edge? Well, if you look at the UK, historically, and I'm not going back too far, the internet in the UK stopped in Docklands and in Slough. And if you then wanted to access any services over the internet, it was long-lined from there. And that was fine when you didn't mind having a little circle going around on your screen. But nobody's prepared to accept that anymore. So what you need is the internet closer and closer to the user, and whether that's a business user or a consumer, it really doesn't matter. The applications that are coming out need to be accessible closer, and an awful lot of them increasingly need to be processed closer, because what you're seeing with an awful lot of new requirements is that storage of data might be fine at a distance, but the actual compute platforms and processing needs to be much more local. The latency requirements for applications are lower and lower. You need a response much quicker, and that response needs to be 15 miles down the road rather than 200 miles down the road. And as such, what we're looking to do is to be able to offer companies the ability to locate their data closer to the consumer. That way, they can have a competitive edge. If you offer a bad service, then somebody will move from your service to another one if they can offer something better. By offering local compute, we're enabling them to offer a better service to their customers. And if you look at the way that connectivity is evolving in the UK as well, that's all playing into the fact that edge compute is essential, that processing locally is essential. The biggest thing that's happening in the connectivity market, as opposed to the colo market in the UK, is the deployment of full fibre and the growth of the altnets in the country. So you can go to any town in the UK and there will either be a tendering process taking place for a full fibre deployment for business and for consumers, or there will already be a network just deployed. And that means that rather than the 10 megabyte service that you might have had from the your traditional internet service providers in the UK, you can now have gigabit services, and the difference is enormous locally. That's fine. So you've got gigabit to the premise. It's got to go to it's got to go to a location where whatever you're actually consuming can be processed. What you don't want to be doing is running gigabit services up and down the country, because for you as a provider of service, that just costs money. So you've got latency and cost of transit as the reasons why organizations want to build regional compute platforms. And the full fibre deployment is happening now. We've got another wave coming with 5G really quickly. And that's just going to reinforce that situation.
So in terms of the demand for that, because I mean, your business model is interesting, you say, so you kind of inherit an anchor tenant by the way you acquire a data center, and then you obviously take the extra space and sell that. So I guess how is that working in terms of the response? Or do you anticipate, are you sort of building out this edge? You say you're hopefully by the end of the year, you'll have 10 and eventually 20. Are you anticipating that whether it's next year or 2023, there will be the avalanche for the edge when the 5G infrastructure sort of catches up? Or how do you characterize, I guess, what your customers are up to now and what do you think the future will hold on that basis?
I think that you can categorize customer demand in a number of areas, really, for regional co-location or regional edge co-location. So if you look at our sites, who are the customers we anticipate bringing in? So initially, we have the anchor customer. Now, there could be multiple anchor customers in there, because it may be a systems integrator, for example, who has customers of their own in that location. But you've got those organizations which typically are traditional users of co-location services, be they a bank, be they, in the case of systems integrator, it could be power companies, it could be literally anybody that they've done an outsource deal with over the last 10 years, for example. Or in the case of, we acquired 2 sites in the Northwest, which were previously owned by a large global manufacturer. And they did their global compute from those 2 locations. They still do that, and they'll be there for the next X years as part of the contract we have with them. That's the initial basis of a successful data center site, because one thing that isn't successful about data centers is if they're empty. It's like, you're either desperately trying to get your anchor customer in, or you're thinking, well, what's going to happen with this site? It's not covering the cost of running it. So our sites stand on their own 2 feet, and they are active from day one when they become part of our portfolio. Our target markets going forward, and this is the proposition that we put to the financial markets when we went out looking for funding. We see the future of edge data center requirements being exactly what you would expect me to say, which is CDNs, streaming media, gaming, hyperscale edge POPs, all of the requirements, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, all the things that need to be processed locally, all the things that need distributed access and are continuing to grow with the changes in the way that we consume technology. So we are working with all of those organizations. What we have also seen is a groundswell of demand from the altnet marketplace. And this is something I hadn't really anticipated, that we've gone into an area, and because of what I said earlier about the fact that there is so much deployment of high-speed fibre at a local level, those organisations, be they organisations like City Fibre, ITS, OGI, there's a whole range of them that you'll be familiar with. When they deploy, they need to create an aggregation hub or multiple aggregation hubs within a location. So they need their own exchange effectively, but they're not going to build an exchange. They really don't want to go into a telco exchange, or typically there isn't enough room in there for them. So what we found is that there's immediate and rapid demand from organizations like that, from the altnets, to actually deploy collocation into our data centers as soon as we actually acquire them. And I had a call with one yesterday, gave me a list of 6 towns. I'm not saying we're actually going to be in all of them, but this is where we are going. Yeah, have you got anything we could use in those locations? And they put multiple racks in there. They then deliver the fiber out to the end user. The end user has access to the data center. And what we're seeing off the back of what's going on there is that the tier 1 carriers, the Zaos, Colts, EUs, they're basically coming into the data centers if they're not already there, because they and the altnets are working together to provide the level of connectivity for their customers. So they come in, and then what we're also seeing is that there are multiple ISPs, whether they be local, national, or global ISPs like Cogent, for example. They're following these organizations round, and they're looking to deploy into regional data centers as well. So what you end up with is a highly connected environment that becomes very attractive for, I guess, 2 types of end users. It becomes far more attractive for the target market for an edge data center, a classic edge data center requirement, the CDNs, the gaming companies, streaming medias, because of that rich connectivity that gets created. And then the second one, which again I hadn't anticipated, but it is very interesting, is the demand from regional organizations is much greater than we anticipated. So regional organizations are being prompted, I'm talking about regional business, so regional government, that they're being prompted to look at their compute platform requirements by the fact that full fiber is being deployed in their regions, and they're waking up to the fact that they have the level of connectivity that they thought wouldn't exist in their areas. So what they are now doing is they're looking at what do we do? Where do we keep all our servers? And I've been astonished by how many companies are first-time colo customers, moving out of in-house data centers in inverted commas. And you can look at regional governments. You look at quite large deals where they've been running them inside their own premises. What they're now looking to do is to monetize the real estate they've got. Stop running a data center themselves, move it into colo, because the colo is local to them. They have no desire, for example, if they're based in the Northwest, to put their compute platform in Slough. All of a sudden, they can put it 10 miles down the road, 20 miles down the road if they want. If they want two failover sites, for example, we have a solution for that, and it's local and it's highly connected. So we're seeing far more regional demand than anticipated, is probably the best way to describe that. And all of that is prompted by the level of connectivity that's now available to them.
Yeah, I was going to ask, but I think in the various answers you've given, maybe a non-starter, that potentially a bit of a trend about sort of bringing co-location on premises to the end user, but it sounds like you're kind of doing that, but in the process you're also acquiring the end user's data center, so that may not be relevant to you. I guess the other thing, perhaps, sorry, if I could just ask a sort of part two, is that a lot of colos are feeling, well, either under pressure or looking at offering, start offering services as well as pure colo. It sounds like you're quite busy, so I guess two things, sort of the on-prem colo bit, and then not pure colo, but adding some services on top. Any thought?
Okay, so I guess there's a couple of parts to that, but moving on premise and closer to the user, it comes back a bit to what do you mean by edge? And edge means a whole range of things to different people. It means from, if you asked several large US colocation providers, they'd class edge as Marseille, or we're going to put a data center in Zurich. That's an edge site because it's not in the States. It's one per country would be their view of edge. We take a completely different view where it's a down at the national level, it's across the regions, and then the next level of edge really is about the micro edge side of things, we see the growth of micro edge. It's not necessarily something that we would be driving towards, because we see that as being a relatively specialized marketplace, where there will be hundreds, maybe thousands of whether they be boxes at the side of the road, whether they be small containers underneath football stadiums. It's a different play, and I can see that being mopped up by specialist organizations who are involved maybe in mobile phone towers. That sort of thing is where I see the micro edge going to. Moving on premise, and there's two parts I think to your question. One was moving data centers on premise, and the other was providing additional services to customers, whether they be on or off premise. But moving on prem, I see that happening in specialized situations, and I see it around some of the 5G deployments. If you look at some of the early private 5G deployments, that's a classic example. I think Telens announced what they considered to be the first on-prem deployment this week. So Telens have deployed for a large construction company at a very large sort of building site in, I think, in London, and that's classic, moving that onto the site, and there'll be a mobile edge compute platform there in a box of whatever size. It could be the size of a shipping container. And that's moving on premise, I guess. I've seen it in a couple of environments. We've had discussions with port authorities about doing something similar, but it still then needs pulling back to a secondary location, because there's only so much storage you can do there. Otherwise, you're building your own huge data center, and not many people want to do that. So I see the on-prem bit being probably the micro edge element. I see that happening probably a lot in the future as things get more and more distributed. And what I see there is that our regional sites are basically pulling the data back from the on-prem, and that the national and international sites become more deep storage. So effectively, it becomes like a classic logistics network. And it doesn't matter whether it's data storage or whatever else storage it is. It could be a food distribution network where you've got a national site, and it gets shipped overnight to a region and then shipped very short term to the actual user. We're just not shipping overnight, it's shipping over milliseconds. So that's part answer, I guess. The other part to your question was additional services. And I've seen that, and as have you, no doubt, with several organizations who typically have looked to become more of a managed cloud provider. So the bolt-on additional services, it's not just about co-location. And I class that as a different marketplace. We offer pure co-location. At our heart, we're a real estate company. We're a technical real estate company. And we offer high quality co-location to organizations that want to locate compute platforms on our premises. And a very large number of those are going to be managed service providers. And what we don't want to do is to compete with them. And we don't want to get involved in the complexities of delivering that managed service. We see the strength of what we offer and our ability to grow very quickly in a relatively pure model where we're focused on delivering space, power, security, connectivity.
Okay, maybe if we can, before we finish, move on to sort of one of the major industry issues at the moment. I guess it's not just for the industry. I guess the whole world is scratching their heads at the moment. We're talking about power, and I guess that's potentially a subset of environment sustainability issues with COP26, I think, on the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
So just, I guess, sort of thoughts both on behalf of Proximity and maybe the industry more generally, in terms of, you are sort of optimist or pessimist when it comes to power availability for the industry and what it might need to do to maintain the resilience. And secondly, I suppose, just the sustainability pressures on all of us, but the data center industry, do you think it's responding sort of well enough and timely enough, or do you think at some stage someone's going to start knocking on the door and saying, here's some legislation, this is what you've got to do by this date, otherwise? Sorry, I know that's cool. We could have a separate conversation about this, but if you can,
it's quite wide ranging. Yeah.
Share some thoughts as to, I guess, what Proximity does sustainability wise, and then the industry generally sort of currently, and what might need to be done in the future.
Okay, so if I start by what we do, and then I'll just give you a few personal thoughts on the wider picture. So when we buy a site, we obviously do a whole series of different due diligence assessments, and one of them is an environmental assessment. So we look at the environmental impact of each site and how that could potentially be improved as and when it becomes part of our portfolio. And what we look at is all the standard things like, what's the current PUE, how can that be improved? And a large part of what we're doing is, because we're buying sites which have typically been single user and quite often have not been commercially sold, we're actually significantly improving the PUE and a whole range of different aspects of environmental efficiency in a site, because we're moving it to a commercial model. So if you're running your own data center for your own use, you're less bothered about the PUE, generally speaking. You're less bothered about how much power is being used, because it's an internal cost. We change that around very quickly. We look to make containment more efficient, all the basic things that you would do in a commercial data center. So we are making an impact there, but on a sort of wider basis, what we look at is what can be changed. Can we put long-term battery storage in there? Can we smooth the power usage? Is there an alternative use? Can we look at wind power on a site? Is there potential for solar at each of the sites? And at each of the sites, we look at each criteria, and then we look at where the power is being bought from, and we progressively change each site to move it to our own contracts. We work specifically with SSE for our power sourcing, and the reason we do that is that we have a contract with them where all of our power isn't just bought from SSE, it's bought from Scottish Hydro. So Scottish Hydro provide the most renewable power sourcing that you can possibly get in the UK. It's from hydroelectric, as the name suggests, and we move all the data centers to that. So We also then look at the building infrastructure as the ways that we can change that to improve the power efficiency at each location. So we take it very seriously. It's critical for our customers. The type of organizations that we work with, whether they be regional authorities or whether they be global cloud providers, they look for evidence that we're taking it seriously. And it's part of our commitment to our investors as well. So that's really Proximity's niche view. If you look at the industry and you look at what's going on, power prices are going up at the moment. That's a challenge in itself as to how that is reflected back through users, because generally speaking, most pricing models, that power cost reflects straight back to the end user, because power and colo are separate within most contracts these days, which means that you as the end user, you pay for whatever power you actually use at the price that it's being bought at. So that's one aspect. From a UK perspective, I see positive things happening. The cable between Scandinavia, between Norway and the UK, that was announced in the last couple of weeks. Having access to things like the hydroelectric power generation that is available in Norway is critical to the data center industry. We're a massive user of power, and that there are limited ways that we can generate renewables in the UK efficiently. So bringing in power from elsewhere is a really good step forward, I think. As to utilization, improving that, potentially you can look at running sites more efficiently. You can look at cooling sites in different ways. If you look at some of the technology, the way that liquid immersion cooling, for example, it is coming along, you get more compute from an amount of power. So progressively, I do think we will see a greater efficiency in the way that the actual compute platforms consume power as well.
Just to the final bit, do you think sort of the people are talking about carbon taxes and all sorts anyway, but do you think the data center industry specifically will be targeted for some kind of tax, although will there be some recognition that although it's a problem in the sense it consumes a lot of power, as we're doing today, it's stopping us having to travel hundreds of miles and do lots of things that aren't very environmentally friendly to meet up, whereas this way is presumably the carbon footprint of this is infinitely smaller than a physical meeting. So there's that kind of dilemma, tension, I don't know, between the good that the data center industry does and the bad.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point, really, because you've got two aspects. One is taxation, and government's taxation policies are not necessarily determined by what the right thing is to do. It is what they need to tax things, and that might be the case that taxation is brought in, and that could affect the strength of the data center industry in a particular country. So not just the UK, but if you look across the world, there are growing areas of data center clusters which could be impacted negatively if a specific country decides to impose a specific tax on that industry. And governments need to think carefully about that, because the data center industry does bring in other investments into a country, and then the balancing act, which is a nice way to look at it. You have multiple meetings each week where you may well have got on a plane. You would have traveled 200 miles. Whatever power is being used in the data center to actually deliver the meeting that you have is far less than the carbon footprint that you would have left if you'd driven 200 miles up to Edinburgh or wherever it is you decide it needs to go to. And if you look at that, if I look at our company, the directors of our company are distributed throughout the UK. So we have 2 in Scotland. We have me in the middle of the country, and one of the guys is based near London. We conduct the majority of our meetings on Teams. Historically, we would have conducted the majority of our meetings in London, Edinburgh, or Birmingham, and the difference is massive. Whether or not the meetings are quite as efficient is another point, but I think we've all learned to conduct business in a completely different way over the last 2 years. So if anything good's come out of the last 2 years, I do think that there is a positive side where we're actually traveling less, costing businesses less, and actually making a far smaller carbon footprint as a result.
And just one other thought. I mean, on that point, you say we've all learned to conduct business. Do you think there'll be a similar need for consumers to sort of understand that they can't just go on endlessly storing photos of family, pets, or the people that offer those services will actually have to start charging them a proper amount, which might change, in turn, obviously change their behaviour, because storage is. I remember I did work in the storage industry, and there was a company that was trying to offer, massive amount of storage for free to all its customers. I'm not sure they ever managed it, but it is given away at sort of rock bottom prices. Whereas that kind of thing, there'll be pricing required to change that kind of behaviour, and even the sort of big data. Everyone hold on to all your data because it's incredibly valuable. You can do all this stuff with it. At some stage, we have to say to people, actually, a lot of your data isn't that valuable, and can you bin it, because we can't just keep building more and more facilities to store it.
I was having this conversation with somebody recently, and they were discussing why people don't use more video to demonstrate a particular thing than photographs. And I said to him, I said, well, partly because video takes up far more storage space, and that never occurred to him in his business that by using video it was actually going to cost him more. But I do think the trend will continue, where we use more and more storage for what is relatively low level, unimportant data. And I think 2 things will happen. I think that consumers and businesses will progressively accept that they spend more and more money. It'll be relatively small amounts of money that they spend more storing electronic medium. Everybody pays Apple, or certainly pay Samsung as well, for storage of what you've got on your phone. Think back a few years ago, nobody would have been prepared to do that at all. Why on earth would I do that? Just to store some photographs? But everybody accepts that that's what they do. And every so often you get told that you've filled up your storage. And would you like to spend another 80p or whatever it is? And you just go, yeah, fine. That's good. So progressively, it comes more and more. And I think the flip side of that is that the providers of that storage are finding more and more efficient, cost-effective ways to store vast amounts of data. And whether that be cold storage outside of the UK for non-sensitive data. So if you look at the success of the Scandinavian data center industry at the moment, that's mostly predicated on deep storage. And you can store data over there because you don't need to instantly access it. It hasn't got a latency issue to it. It can come back, you can watch it, it's fine. And they can store data at a much more cost-effective way. And probably coming back to the previous point, the cost of power is so much lower there as well. So the overall cost is dramatically lower. Even if you stay in country, you have providers of storage like AWS, for example. So they are about to launch a new storage product, which is part It's an integral part of each availability zone, but they're deliberately planning to locate it away from the central site because it's lower density. It doesn't require the same SLAs. It doesn't require the same level of security potentially. So they'll locate it in a different site, which costs less. So it's just finding ways to actually store it more cost effectively and people accepting that it's part of what they buy.
So I guess in conclusion then, is it fair to say that the data center industry is beginning to become much more nuanced, whereas previously it was almost like, well, there were not that many options, whereas now you think there's going to be a lot more granularity and people will think a lot more about the type of applications, where they need to be, when, why, how, and as you say, although for a lot of the content people and the 5G apps that require sort of instant turnaround, local, regional, whatever will work, but for a lot of other things, whether it's, as you say, Scandinavia or I don't know, even further north or whatever, there'll be large buildings just storing stuff that might be needed, but it really doesn't matter if it sort of arrives this second or in a minute's time even. But
I think there's a massive evolution going on in the data center industry, and it's driven by new applications and by dramatic increases in volume. And the sort of trends that I see on the horizon are a requirement for local compute platforms, a requirement for edge, and you'd expect me to say that. I see a requirement for regional hubs, and I see national hubs becoming bigger and bigger. So the way that typically sites around Slough, Hayes, Stockley Park have evolved with third-party co-location driven primarily by the main hyperscale providers. If you look at what their plans are for the next few years, they will use up the capacity that's available, but they're all planning to build huge sites of their own. So they will build one or two huge sites in each key country, and they will become the central hub. And they will look progressively for third-party solutions on a regional and edge basis. And then if you're looking at long-term storage, then they'll look at low-cost countries. And those low-cost countries, I'm talking now about Scandinavia, low-cost countries could become countries where solar power is freely available, for example, because of the wider evolution of the global fiber network. That's got huge investments in it, and one of the ways that you can actually utilize that to everybody's benefit would be to put less critical compute platforms in areas where power is very low cost, whether that be wind, solar, or hydroelectric.
That's great. I mean, we've covered from starting from edge data centers in the UK. We've covered a lot of ground. So I've really enjoyed it, and thanks for sharing your insights, John. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, enjoyed it. Thank you very much.